In March 2023, he was discovered severely dehydrated and delirious on a remote stretch of coastline in the Pacific. This is his account. I'd spent most of my adult life on the water. It was the only place that ever made sense to me, where the horizon stretched unbroken and the rules were simple. You respected the weather, you respected the currents, and if you were lucky, they respected you in return. But that morning, luck had nothing to do with it. I don't remember the exact moment the squall rolled over the horizon. One minute the ocean was a placid sheet of blue, reflecting a sky so clear it almost looked artificial. The next, the wind shifted, and a line of black clouds rose like a living wall. I'd learned to read weather. I knew the subtle cues, the way the air changed when a storm was gathering its strength. This time, there was no warning. Just a sudden, terrible certainty that I was in the wrong place and the ocean was about to remind me how small I really was. I tried to turn the boat into the wind, but the gusts came faster than I could react. The mainsail snapped and tore free, whipping itself into a tangled mess. The bow slewed sideways, and a wave struck hard enough to send me sprawling across the deck. I remember the taste of salt in my mouth, and the sound, so much louder than I'd ever imagined, of the hull groaning under the strain. Then the world inverted. I must have blacked out. When I came to, I was face down on something that wasn't moving. My body ached in ways I couldn't fully catalog. Bruises layered over bruises, a throbbing pain behind my right eye that made me nauseous when I tried to sit up. I forced myself to lift my head. White sand stretched in every direction. A jagged line of palms shivered under a hot wind, their fronds clicking together like dry bones. I was alive. Somehow, against every rational expectation, I'd washed up on a beach instead of sinking under the weight of my own mistakes. I rolled onto my back and stared at the sky. It was a perfect blue again, as if the storm had never existed. For a long time, I didn't move. Survival wasn't just a matter of will, it was also a matter of timing, of dumb chance. And this time, I'd survived by no virtue of my own. Eventually, I sat up. My throat burned with thirst. My lips were cracked and swollen. When I looked down, I realized I still had my belt knife strapped across my hip. The sight of it steadied me. A small, practical tool, proof that I hadn't lost everything. I got to my feet slowly, testing my weight on each leg. Nothing broken. Nothing bleeding in a way that would end me in the next few hours. I turned in a slow circle. Behind me, the beach curved toward a rocky headland. To the north, dense green foliage crowded the sand, vines spilling onto the tide line. I saw no sign of my boat. No debris, no mast jutting from the shallows. Either it had gone down further out, or the storm had scattered it beyond the point of finding. I felt a hollowness in my chest that had nothing to do with injury or thirst. I was alone, and no one knew exactly where I'd been when the storm hit. I forced myself to start moving. Standing still was worse than exhaustion. It left too much room for the realization to root itself in my mind. I walked the high tide line, scanning for anything useful. After 20 minutes, I found a single plastic container wedged between two rocks. Inside was a small emergency kit, water purification tablets, a packet of dried rations, a bright orange signal mirror. I closed my eyes and let out a slow, shaky breath. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sun was climbing fast, turning the sand into a blinding expanse. I needed shelter before the heat finished with the storm it started. I turned toward the tree line and started walking, every step an act of deliberate will. I told myself I would survive, because the alternative wasn't worth considering yet. The first steps into the tree line felt like crossing an invisible boundary.
The sun vanished behind a tangle of green so dense it swallowed the light in an instant. Humid air pressed against my skin, carrying the sharp, layered smells of earth, salt, and something sweeter I couldn't quite place. I paused just beyond the first row of trees, adjusting my eyes to the sudden gloom. My pulse thumped in my temples, faster than it should have been from such a short walk. I reminded myself this was no different than any other shoreline I'd explored, just another pocket of wildness that would become familiar if I moved carefully. But I couldn't shake the sense that the jungle was watching me in return. I moved inland slowly, checking the ground before each step. The sand gave way to rich, dark soil tangled with roots. Broad leaves drooped overhead, dripping condensation in slow, rhythmic taps. A little further on, I found a fallen tree with a hollow beneath the trunk. Inside, shadows pooled so dark I couldn't see the bottom. I crouched to look closer, and that's when I saw the first track. A smooth, curved depression in the soil, maybe the width of my forearm. It trailed away into the underbrush in a gentle arc, disappearing under a curtain of vines. Snake. Probably a big one. I swallowed, feeling the tightness in my throat return. I dealt with snakes before, but never in a place where I had no backup, no chance to call for help if things went wrong. I eased back onto my heels and forced myself to stand. One threat at a time. Right now, the bigger danger was dehydration. I continued inland, angling toward higher ground in the hope of finding fresh water. The jungle grew thicker as I climbed, a living wall of trunks and hanging lianas that scraped my shoulders with every step. Sweat stung my eyes. My shirt clung damp to my spine. Then, after another hour of slow progress, I heard it. A steady trickle of water, hidden somewhere ahead. I pushed through a curtain of vines and nearly stumbled into a narrow stream winding through a shallow gully. The water was clear enough to see smooth stones on the bottom. I knelt and filled the signal mirror's shallow cup, forcing myself to drink in slow sips. The cold shocked my tongue, chased away some of the fog that had been gathering behind my eyes. When I drunk my fill, I splashed my face and sat back on my heels. It wasn't much of a victory, but it was enough to steady my thoughts. I took out the small ration pack and forced myself to eat a few mouthfuls. The taste was like chalk and salt, but it calmed the hollow ache in my stomach. For the first time since the storm, I let myself believe I might survive this. I stood and began following the stream uphill, hoping it might lead to a better vantage point. As I climbed, the trees thinned. Sunlight filtered through in bright shafts, dappling the forest floor in gold and shadow. I stopped to catch my breath near a stand of bamboo. Something glittered near the base of one stalk, metal, half buried in loam. I brushed away the leaves. It was the rusted hinge of an old crate. I knelt, fingers tracing the edges of a wooden panel almost swallowed by roots. Someone had been here before. How long ago, I couldn't guess. I felt my heart speed up in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. It was proof, small, undeniable proof, that I wasn't the first to wash up on this shore. And maybe not the first to try and survive it. I forced myself to stand, though every instinct wanted to tear the crate free and see what it held. Later. First, I needed to find a place to set up shelter before the heat faded into night. I turned to scan the slope again. Somewhere behind me, a branch shifted with a sound too heavy to be wind alone. I held still, breath caught in my throat. Nothing moved. But the certainty settled in my chest like a stone. I was not alone in these trees. I stood listening so long my legs began to cramp. The trees settled back into their familiar rustle, leaves ticking in the breeze. I tried to tell myself it was only an animal, something small rooting in the undergrowth. But the certainty wouldn't leave. I turned back to the crate half buried in soil. My hands shook as I cleared more debris away. The wood was soft with rot. When I pressed gently against the side, it caved in with a muffled crack. Inside, a few scraps of canvas clung to rusted loops, maybe part of a pack once. Nothing else remained but damp earth and the smell of mold. I sat back on my heels, feeling a dull disappointment. Still, it meant someone had tried to make a place here. Someone had fought to stay alive, however long ago that might have been. I stood and forced myself to keep moving. The stream narrowed as it climbed. Soon it was no more than a trickle threading through mossy stones. When I reached the top of the rise, the jungle opened into a shallow clearing. Sunlight poured across the space, catching on something pale and out of place. I approached slowly, heart thumping harder with every step. A skeletal frame of bamboo lashed together with fraying rope stood at the far edge of the clearing. Underneath lay a scatter of belongings, a cracked water jug, the remains of a tarp, a length of rope so weathered it had fused into the dirt. It wasn't ancient, but it wasn't recent either. I crouched to touch the rope, testing the fibers. Brittle. Years, maybe. I scanned the ground for footprints, but found only the blurred impressions of animal tracks, some round-padded, some narrower. I didn't want to think too hard about how many of those might have belonged to snakes. My gaze caught on something near the collapsed tarp. A long, sinuous trail pressed into the earth, wider than the one I'd seen by the hollow log. I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten. I'd spent enough time in the field to recognize a constrictor's path when I saw one. And this one was big. I eased back to my feet, careful not to step across the track. Some part of me wanted to abandon the clearing altogether, but the practical side knew it was the best place I'd found. Relatively open, high enough to stay dry, close to water. I set my pack down on the flattest patch of ground. I took stock of what I had left. Few purification tablets, half a ration pack, my belt knife, and the signal mirror. The flare gun was gone, lost in the storm, or wrenched free when I'd been thrown overboard. I felt the weight of that absence settle over my shoulders like another layer of exhaustion. I'd have to rely on what I could improvise. Before doing anything else, I cleared the debris in a wide circle, giving myself as much visibility as I could manage. Every few minutes, I paused to scan the tree line. Once, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a low ripple between two trunks. I held still until the silence stretched too long to bear. Nothing emerged. When the clearing was as clean as I could make it, I used the length of tarp to rig a crude lean-to. It wouldn't keep out much rain, but it would shade me from the sun and mark the spot if a search plane ever passed overhead. By late afternoon, I was trembling with fatigue. My limbs felt hollow, my thoughts thin and glassy. I forced myself to eat the last of the ration pack, chewing until the paste dissolved on my tongue. I drank another cup from the stream, listening to the wind pick up in the canopy. Somewhere nearby, a bird shrieked, sharp and sudden enough that I flinched. When the echo died, I realized the jungle had fallen almost completely silent. I sat back under the lean-to, clutching my belt knife in both hands. I told myself I'd survived worse, but as the sky darkened, I couldn't shake the image of that broad snake track threading through the clearing. and the certainty that it would return when night fell. When darkness came, it came all at once. The last sliver of sunlight drained from the clearing like it had been siphoned away, leaving behind a cold blue twilight that sank into the ground and clung to everything it touched. I tried to keep busy. I checked the knots on the tarp shelter twice, rearranged my supplies, collected a pile of dead leaves and twigs I could use for tinder, though I had no way to ignite them yet. Anything to avoid sitting still and listening to the jungle remind me how alone I was.
But there came a point when there was nothing left to do. So I sat with my back to the bamboo frame, the belt knife across my lap. My heart beat slow and heavy, each thump echoing in my ears. Time blurred. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized the sounds had changed. The insects had gone quiet. The wind no longer stirred the canopy. All that remained was my own ragged breathing. And something else. A slow, deliberate sliding that came from just beyond the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint it. It stopped. The silence pressed so thick it felt like the jungle itself was holding its breath with me. Then it came again, closer this time, moving with the patient certainty of something that had never known fear. I tightened my grip on the knife. My palms were slick with sweat. I told myself it was nothing, just a branch falling, or some harmless lizard making its way through the leaves. But when I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, I saw it. A pale coil sliding over the roots in a slow arc. Longer than I was tall, thick as my thigh in the widest part. I didn't move. The snake paused halfway into the clearing, its head lifting to taste the air. Even in the dim light, I could see the flicker of its tongue, the slow flecks of muscle beneath mottled scales. It turned its head in my direction. I felt something cold flood my chest, some ancient recognition that I was prey, and that it knew it. I thought about standing, about making myself look larger, but instinct pinned me to the ground. The snake began to move again, uncoiling itself with impossible grace. It glided across the leaf litter, passing no more than 6 feet from where I sat frozen. I felt the heat leach from my limbs. My breath sounded too loud, too human. When it reached the far side of the clearing, it paused again. Its head turned, sweeping back in my direction. I waited for it to slide closer, to taste the air over my skin, to decide whether I was worth the effort. Instead, it eased into the undergrowth and vanished. Only then did I realize I was shaking so hard the knife's blade rattled against my leg. I forced myself to count to 100 before I moved. My legs refused to support me at first, so I crouched low, scanning every shadow. Nothing stirred. Slowly, I retreated into the shelter, tucking my legs tight to my chest. I rested the knife on my knee and pressed the back of my hand to my mouth to keep from making any noise. The hours crawled past in a haze of half-dreams. Every time a leaf shifted or a bird called, I felt my heartbeat surge back into my throat. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke, dawn was creeping through the trees. The snake was gone, but the impression of its passing remained, a smooth trail that cut across the clearing, so vivid it felt like a warning etched into the earth itself. When the sun finally lifted above the trees, it felt almost unreal, like I'd slipped into some private dimension where night and fear had no end, and dawn was a story I'd only half remembered.
I sat in the shelter, staring at the snake track etched across the clearing. My muscles felt brittle, as if the slightest movement might shatter something essential inside me. I hadn't slept in any real sense. My thoughts kept circling the same tight loop, the memory of that pale coil sliding past, the certainty that it would come back, the realization that I had no plan if it did. I forced myself to stand. My legs wobbled under me, but they held. I took slow, deliberate breaths until the shaking eased. Then I gathered what little gear I had left and set about making the clearing more secure, or at least convincing myself that I was doing something useful. I piled up a ring of deadfall branches along the perimeter. It would stop a snake determined to cross, but it might slow it enough to give me warning. Next, I cleared a swath of undergrowth near the stream, creating a space where I could see anything approaching. The work helped. Movement gave shape to the hours, anchored me to something other than fear. When the sun climbed higher, the heat returned. The air turned thick and metallic, sticking to my skin in a way that made me feel half dissolved. I drank sparingly from the stream, using the last of the purification tablets. Each swallow felt like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I kept my knife close, always within reach. And still I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once I thought I saw movement in the shadows at the tree line, a slow ripple, a shifting shape that vanished the instant I tried to focus. It wasn't just the snake anymore. It was the island itself, a presence that felt too deliberate to be chance. By midday, exhaustion had blurred the edges of my thoughts. I sat under the lean-to with my back against the bamboo frame, blinking against the glare. The sky above was impossibly blue, the kind of color you see on postcards but never expect to find in the real world. I tried to imagine rescue. A shape on the horizon, a voice crackling over a radio. But every time I let the thought grow, another part of me whispered that no one was coming, that the storm had wiped my position from any chart, that I was just one more name that would vanish into the long list of those who never returned. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the slow, deliberate beat of my heart. As long as that rhythm continued, I still had choices. I forced myself to eat the last crumbs of the ration pack. The taste turned my stomach, but I swallowed anyway. Later, when the shadows lengthened, I climbed a low rise at the clearing's edge. From the top, I could see the coastline in glimpses, pale sand curving away until it vanished behind the trees. No sign of my boat, no sign of debris, just the endless blue of the ocean beyond. I scanned the horizon until my eyes burned. Nothing. I climbed back down, every step heavier than the last. As night fell, the jungle began to stir again. The sounds returned, the clicking insects, the mournful calls of birds I couldn't name. I sat with my knife in hand, watching the darkness gather in the spaces between the trees. I told myself I would survive the night, and the one after, and however many came after that, because the only alternative was to give in to the quiet voice that kept whispering how easy it would be to stop fighting. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch shifted. I tightened my grip on the knife and waited. The night felt longer than any that had come before. I sat curled under the lean-to, the knife resting across my knees, trying not to think about how thin the shelter's walls were, how little separated me from everything waiting in the dark. Every sound felt magnified, the rustle of leaves, the drip of condensation from the tarp, the slow, deliberate sliding that sometimes returned to the edges of the clearing. I knew the snake was still out there, waiting. At some point near dawn, exhaustion overtook fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and for a few precious moments I drifted into something like sleep. I dreamed of the storm, of waves that lifted me higher and higher until the sky itself seemed to open. When I woke, the sun had already cleared the trees. The heat struck me like a physical blow. My skin felt burned, my mouth so dry I could barely swallow.
I stumbled to the stream and drank until my stomach cramped. The water tasted faintly metallic, but I didn't care. When I returned to the shelter, I forced myself to sit and think. Another day meant another chance. Maybe today a plane would pass overhead. Maybe someone would notice the signal mirror I'd propped against the bamboo frame, glinting in the sun. I stood and climbed the rise again, scanning the horizon. At first there was nothing but blue and glare. Then, near the northern curve of the bay, something moved. I blinked, thinking it was another trick of heat and exhaustion. But when I shielded my eyes, I saw it clearly, a shape, bobbing just beyond the surf. White hull, bright markings, a boat. The surge of relief was so strong my knees almost gave out. I raised the mirror and angled it toward the water, sending flashes of light in slow, deliberate sweeps. I had no idea if anyone was watching, but it was the only signal I had left. Minutes dragged by. My arm began to ache from holding the mirror steady. Then, impossibly, the boat began to turn. I felt a sound escape my throat, a raw, broken laugh I hadn't known I was holding inside. The hull drew closer, cutting a slow arc toward the shore. When it grounded in the shallows, a man in a broad hat jumped over the side. He waded through the surf, raising a hand in greeting. "Hey!" he called, voice rough with surprise. "You all right?" I tried to answer, but nothing came out. My throat was too dry, my thoughts too tangled to form words. I raised my hand instead, feeling tears sting my sunburned skin. He reached me in a few strides and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Easy," he said. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt unreal. I let him guide me toward the boat, every step an effort of will. When I turned for one last look, I saw the clearing as if from a distance, the crude shelter, the smooth track where the snake had passed, so fresh it seemed to glisten in the morning light. A reminder that survival was never guaranteed, only earned moment by moment. I climbed into the boat and sank onto a bench, feeling the engine's vibration rumble under my palms. As the hull turned back toward open water, I finally let my eyes close. I didn't know where I was going, or how long it would take to find my way back to anything like the life I'd known before. But for the first time since the storm, I believed I would see another shore, and that was enough.